Stor applåd för Rory Sutherland.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we've had quite a lot of talks, quite rightly, I think, suggesting that you've got to partition things 60-40, 80-20. And by the way, that whole principle of partitioning is really, really important. Because one of the great mistakes business has is it has a single metric it tends to want a single metric for everything. And if you've got a single metric for everything, you actually go badly wrong. You become over-optimized in one direction. You fail to trade off the long term for the short term. You fail to trade off exploiting what you know for discovering what you don't know. And I think quite a lot of the investment community saw this actually in the story of Kraft, that had been taken over by private equity. It had essentially gone through vicious cost cutting, and it had failed. It had done very, very well at efficiency, but rather failed to invest in effectiveness. And so I'm here really to talk about the other 10%. Now, I know there isn't 10% left, but it's also really important in anything you do to leave 10% for the product of experimentation, testing, and, this is the strangest one, pure luck. In other words, you've got to leave enough money free and you've got to do enough eccentric things to give yourself the chance to be lucky. And it's a very strange thing. One of the reasons a lot of people don't like capitalism is that some of the people who do very well under capitalism are actually total idiots, okay? They happened to stumble into a business at exactly the right time. They got lucky. I mean, even spectacularly intelligent people, I think we can argue, I don't think there's any argument that Gates and Jobs are hugely intelligent. They were both spectacularly lucky as well as being hugely intelligent, partly by accident of their birth. If you notice, a lot of those people, Ellison, Gates, Jobs, the giants of the tech industry, were all born within about 18 months of each other. And there was a tiny moment at which you had to be young to make it big in tech. 5 years earlier, they would have ended up working for IBM. 5 years later, it would have been too late. And so one of the important things about capitalism, interestingly, is that it's a mechanism for rewarding people simply for being lucky. And the strangest thing of that is it's precisely that makes people so angry about capitalism. But if you don't have a mechanism that rewards luck, the majority of great discoveries don't get backed. And if you look at the history of science, there's probably as much you can actually attribute to lucky accidents. Penicillin, Viagra, for example, the two wonder drugs. Those were both the product of completely lucky accidents. The discovery of vaccination was just one man who happened to notice that milkmaids didn't get smallpox. Okay? It's just those tiny things that can have huge effects, and we need to leave enough space to actually be lucky. And the very strength of capitalism is precisely that it rewards ideas that at first make no sense. Now, I'll give you an example, okay? I don't own a single piece of denim clothing. I don't understand it, okay? Right? If you had to make a business case for denim, imagine what that would have been like, okay? You'd have to go into a room and say, well, look, it's basically a not very practical form of heavy workwear that's very hot and sweaty in the summer. It fades extremely badly. It's very difficult to maintain, and it's largely popular with indigent Californian workmen. But we predict this is going to be the great fabric of the 20th century. But actually, if you're a Soviet system, you'll never come up with denim, simply because you don't have a mechanism for rewarding or investing in things, the popularity of which we can't explain or understand. And there are more extreme examples than this. Imagine making the business case for Wikipedia. You'd be standing there in front of a lot of investors, and your final sentence would have been, and the best thing of all is people are going to write the whole thing for free, okay? Right? Extraordinarily successful things, at least at first, and sometimes never, make conventional logical sense. And one of the problems you have in business is that business has lost sight of this, and it's become a home for people who are trying to make sense of the world to an extent greater than the world is prepared to give up. Now, one of the reasons all of you who are marketers, basically your finance director hates you, doesn't he? Is that fair? And the reason for that is very simple, which is that economics is one of these social science attempts to make sense of the world. And in order to make the world make sense, it makes enormous assumptions. And two of the assumptions it makes in economics are very simply that people, when they transact, are possessed of perfect information. They know exactly what product they want to buy, they know exactly how much value it will yield to them, and they know exactly how much they're prepared to pay. And they completely trust the person who's selling it to them. There's no uncertainty at all. Now, the reason economists make that ludicrous assumption is in order to make economics mathematically tractable. Because once you put psychology into the equation, things get messy and highly complex. Now, the problem is that your finance director kind of believes that economics is true. Now, some of the more astute of you will have noticed that if you assume perfect information and perfect trust, you've just imagined a world where marketing needn't exist. I freely admit that, okay? If we completely trusted everybody we bought from and we knew exactly what it was we wanted to buy and we were capable objectively of placing a value, context-independent value, on everything we bought according to the utility it would yield, okay? There would be no need for marketing at all, and the only thing you could do is basically reduce cost and therefore improve efficiency. Which is, broadly speaking, what a large number of people in business are trying to do. They see business as an area where effectiveness and efficiency are the same thing. And by the way, a lot of the time they're right. I think one of the great mistakes that creative people often make, and marketers I'd include in that, when they go into business, they'll go and say, well, the thing is, it's all about creativity. It isn't. 90% of business is doing what you know works, doing it more efficiently than you did before, and efficiency and effectiveness in many, many areas, logistics, for example, are probably pretty much the same thing. The problem is there are those areas of business where efficiency and effectiveness are not the same thing. There are areas of life where in order to be efficient, you can't be, in order to be effective, you can't be efficient. One of them is military strategy. Dating would be another one, okay? Very bad dating strategy to try and minimize costs, generally, okay? It wouldn't go down very well. Military strategy is another example. In fact, anything where human psychology, where there's a degree of uncertainty, where you're dealing with the behavior of others, not just the behavior of yourself, there's a divergence between those two things. In military strategy, you can't be perfectly efficient because if you are, the enemy will know exactly what you're going to do. If you'd allowed procurement to plan the D-Day landings, they would have insisted they took place between Dover and Calais to minimize fuel costs. The reason they didn't is someone took a sensible decision to spend more on fuel to land at places which were less well defended. And in the same way in marketing, and I'll explain this in a second, efficient marketing and effective marketing aren't the same thing. Now, what happens in business and why marketing has such a difficult ride is it's got an effectiveness mindset in an efficiency culture. Now, you can see a wonderful example of this in one of my favorite 15 seconds of comic film, where you have a man who has a background in the military who's doing the job of air traffic control. You know the film Airplane. There's a stricken airliner full of lots and lots of passengers, and there are a bunch of people at air traffic control who have to ensure the plane lands safely, even though it's captained by a pilot with, who hasn't flown a plane for 15 years and has significant psychological issues about flying. Now, air traffic control, let me be clear about this, is not an area where I want huge amounts of creativity. Okay? When I fly back this evening, I don't want to think those guys in the tower at Arlanda are going, let's try reversing the direction just for the lols, right? I want people who stick with what works and experiment absolutely minimally. But there are other areas of activity like marketing where you can't be logical, because if you're logical, you end up in exactly the same place as everybody else. And you completely fail to be distinctive. And all acts of distinctiveness require a certain amount of illogic. Let's just watch that bit of film.
Maybe we ought to turn on the searchlights now.
Oh. That's just what they'll be expecting us to do.
Now that's the military mindset in an air traffic control situation. And to some extent, this is why marketers are kind of weirdly frustrating, because we have a natural horror of the obvious. When we hear the words, we'll admit this, come on, our heart sinks a little bit when we hear the words best practice, because it's just doing what everybody else does. Now in logistics, best practice, you might copy from everybody else. McKinsey will do you a fairly good job there. In marketing, by definition, if you follow absolutely narrow best practice, your brand will end up insufficiently differentiated from everybody else's. The opportunity in marketing is actually to be ingeniously inefficient, because that's what gives you distinctiveness. And I think one of the problems we face, I think it's been compounded by the Silicon Valley approach to marketing. Now, Silicon Valley is a fantastic place full of incredibly bright people, but it has an excessive engineering mindset. When I first visited, I was in Menlo Park. I was surprised to see lots of little, really small petrol tankers driving around. And after a while, I said to my host, what the hell are those tiny little petrol tankers doing? And someone said, oh, it's a new business. It's like Uber for gasoline. You ring up this firm and they fill your tank with fuel while you're coding, basically. Okay? And let's be honest, we'd all try it once, wouldn't we? But let's face it, if you were doing that, you've turned your life into a time optimization problem. You've gone slightly bonkers. But also, you've failed to understand context. Why? Because when was the last time anybody stopped at a gas station and only bought petrol? Because you stop at a gas station, you go, oh, shit, I've run out of milk, and oh, look, there's a pork pie, and my wife will never find out, okay? But the fact is that it's very rare to stop at a gas station just to get gasoline. I don't think I can think of a time where I've gone into a gas station, paid for the fuel, not bought anything else, and walked out. So this seems like a wonderfully clever idea, but actually, if you understand the wider context of human behavior, maybe it's not that clever. To be honest, of all the things that could improve my life, it's never occurred to me that not having to fill up with gas would be that big a deal. All right? And to some extent, gas stations have recognized this problem and they've solved it by becoming shops, in any case. And what I call the value vice is where you define the function of something incredibly narrowly. Gas station, there to sell gasoline. Doorman, hotel doorman, there to open. This is what I call the hotel doorman approach, which Silicon Valley would adopt. Hotel doorman, define his function as he's there to open the door. Replace doorman with automatic doors. Job done. Doorman's salary can now be booked as savings, and you can walk away claiming the credit. Management consultancies do this all the time, by the way, as well. You basically create visible savings and invisible costs. Because the problem with this mode of thinking is that the doorman isn't really just there to open the door. He's there to carry your luggage, he's there to provide recognition, he's there to hail taxis, he's there to open the doors of taxis. He's also there to provide an element of security, and he also is there to give the hotel a certain status, in that having a doorman probably means you can charge £200 a night a lot more easily than if you have an automatic door, okay? And so you make this wonderful saving and you go, look, this is so much more efficient than that doorman. Very strange, Silicon Valley. It's full of left-wing people who are basically looking to destroy working-class employment. I've never quite understood that, but that seems to be their main motivation. Oh, look, there's someone there with a job. Let's replace him with an algorithm. Okay? And the problem is you go back, 2 years later, you discover actually the hotel can only charge £150 a night. There's a wino asleep in the doorway, and there are 3 pissed-off people who can't get a taxi. And so that value vice is really interesting. And what it also leads to, if you have what you might call an efficiency mentality, at first, the gains are quite high. Because, this is, to be honest, what WPP found. When you went into a 1980s ad agency, there were quite a lot of efficiency gains. I think J. Walter Thompson had a director's dining room that cost $2 million a year. I think when Martin Sorrell bought Gray, he was nearly caught in a snowstorm and unable to fly to his next meeting, at which point Gray made the slight mistake of saying, "Why don't we get you one of the company planes?" Now, I think Martin spotted that there was some fat to be trimmed, okay? The problem with that efficiency mindset is eventually you run out of space and it leads to incrementalism. That all you're doing is making things a bit better every year. Now, one of the problems with incrementalism is if you want to keep your job, incrementalism is actually not a bad strategy. If you want to keep your job for 5 years, you don't want to get fired, you don't want to have any difficult meetings with your boss, I can't recommend anything more highly than improving everything by about 5% every year. And one of the reasons I suspect that there's so much emphasis on testing media rather than testing creative, there are a variety of reasons for this, but creative will have by far the bigger payoff if you're successful. You know, if you want to have a kind of order of magnitude improvement, testing creative after a time, not immediately, but after a time, will give you a bigger reward or the chance of a bigger leap in efficiency than testing media. The only problem is maybe the people doing it don't want a big leap or improvement. What you want is 6 small ones. Now let me explain this. This is a guy called Sergei Bubka, who was a Ukrainian, although he was a Soviet-era pole vaulter. And under the Soviet system, he was rewarded so that every time he broke the world record for the pole vault, the Soviets would give him like, a ZIL limousine or a new girlfriend, or an apartment with a slightly better view. And if you look at Bubka's career, what you see is that he broke the world record about 15 times by an absolute number of millimeters each time. And they always believed that Bubka never performed up to his full potential because he was terrified of breaking his record by more than half an inch. Because if he broke his record by 3 inches, he'd have to put up with the old girlfriend for 5 years. And this is Kelly the Dolphin. Kelly the Dolphin also discovered the benefits of slow incremental improvement because they trained her to pick up rubbish from the bottom of the pool, and every time she brought up a bit of rubbish, the trainer would give her a bit of fish. And so she set about fairly assiduously cleaning up rubbish from the pool because it was a very good incentive scheme. But very, very quickly, she started gaming the system. Whenever she found a big bit of rubbish, she'd hide it under a rock at the bottom of the pool and bite off little bits one by one and take them up and get a fish every time. And I think we're in trouble here because I think the model of advertising that Silicon Valley has is actually wrong. They're looking at it as if it's an efficiency game, not an effectiveness game. And as engineers, understandably, they're assuming that efficiency and effectiveness in communication are the same thing. Now, just to be clear, sometimes they are. If you're talking to someone who trusts you completely, okay, efficient communication isn't a bad idea. That's better, thank you very much. Okay, so if you have complete trust and you're writing a letter to a friend and your friend doesn't think you're lying, you're not making any great claim, you're not trying to signal anything, you're just communicating a message, then efficient sending of the necessary number of bits in the lowest cost, highest speed form possible, in a purely targeted form, is the right thing to do. That's what you might call messaging. There's a different thing which is called signaling, where the cost of the signal has a bearing on how seriously it's actually taken by the recipient. Now, a flower is basically a weed with an advertising budget, okay? And one of the reasons why a bee can trust a flower, how do I know that flower isn't just lying about the presence of nectar, okay? Because let's face it, I could go and pollinate that flower, turn up, bury myself into the little thing, find there's no nectar there, and bugger off. I've done the flower's work for it, but it's lying. And the reason is, it's not worth investing in a flower unless the bees come back more than once. So if you cheat the bees, they don't come back. So the very cost of producing the flower, which makes the plant much more likely to be eaten, by the way, the cost and risk and extravagance of the flower is a reliable sign of the nectar. In the same way, expensive advertising up front sunk cost only pays if lots of customers buy from you and they come back to buy from you again. So if you're looking for someone who has genuine faith in their product, that it will be repeatedly and widely popular, the cost of both the creation and transmission of the message has a bearing on how well you trust them. Let me give a very simple example of this. Let's say you've got a friend who owns a racehorse, and you say, do you think your horse will win on Saturday? And of course they say, yeah. They always say yes. Cheap talk. Everybody says that. They all believe their horse is going to win. If your friend goes with you and says, come with me, walks into a betting shop, and you see him place £5,000 on his horse to win on Saturday, now he's got skin in the game. He's putting his money where his mouth is, and now you know that's reliable information, because he stands to lose if he's wrong. And likewise, the flower stands to lose if it's making a false promise. It only stands to gain if it's making a genuine promise. The second thing we need to understand is that humans instinctively pay attention to and are convinced by messages which involve something costly. Now, the costliness could be money, media cost, creative effort, craftsmanship, humor, poetry, music, anything that requires something that's scarce, whether that be talent or money. If the communication doesn't involve anything that's scarce, it has a lower level of convincing power on humans, because we've evolved to spot that distinction. If that seems really weird, bees understand the distinction. When they signal a nesting site, the amount of energy they put into actually waving at the nesting site is proportionate to their enthusiasm for it. Okay? So it's actually, I think it's the square of their level of enthusiasm. And the fact that they're prepared to put a huge amount of energy into advertising the site means we can infer that they're serious about it. They're not just bullshitting us. If a bee just went up and went, yeah, over there, right? Okay, we go, well, that doesn't mean shit, does it really? If the bee jumps up and down for half an hour burning lots of scarce energy while directing at that site, the very fact that it's excitable about it and is burning scarce resources means we better pay the bee some attention here. Secondly, high targeting messages don't necessarily mean high trust messages. In fact, there's an inverse relationship between them. When we get married, we get all our friends together, everybody we know, and we make our vows in front of a mass media audience. Why is that much more convincing than going door to door, making your vows, or emailing your vows to your friends one at a time? Because it only takes one person to contradict you and everybody knows you're a liar. A promise you make in a public place, I don't know enough to contradict a lot of promises I see in advertising. But what I do assume is that of the 1,000 people also seeing that poster, if it were bullshit, somebody would call it out. So it takes more confidence, and therefore it's more convincing if we make a promise in a public medium than in a private one. I can actually demonstrate that with a model. This is called costly signaling theory, by the way. It comes from biology, a man called Amos Zahavi. Let me just show an example. If we can just show that web page that I gave you earlier and pop that up on the screen, I think it'll drag across, won't it? This is a model where the red lines are dishonest advertisers. The green lines are honest advertisers. Anybody who makes a sale, if a dishonest or honest advertiser hits an ordinary consumer, they make a sale. Because the dishonest people, we can do this, can we? Is anybody there? Because the dishonest people are lying, they make slightly more profit from a sale than the honest people do. But dotted amongst the customer base, there is a small number of what Don Marty calls norm enforcers, who are people who will punish an advertiser for lying to them. They'll write to the papers, they'll call them out, they'll basically say, that isn't true, I bought one of your products and it was shit. Okay? This is what happens. Can we do it, do you think? Yeah, we can. Brilliant. Now watch over time. In the early days, there are more dishonest advertisers. The green ones are fairly small. The blue lines are what happens when someone hits a norm enforcer and gets punished. What you will very quickly see, and this is models running afresh, it does this every time, is over time you will see that the honest people can basically advertise indiscriminately to anybody. The dishonest people are all short-range advertisers. They're all advertising to a very small niche of gullible people. They can't afford to go any further afield because they'll hit a norm enforcer. Does that make sense? So what we're actually saying is, it doesn't strike me as impossible that humans instinctively find messages displayed in print, in a newspaper, on television, in the Super Bowl, as inherently more trustworthy than messages that, for all they know, might be delivered to them alone at a cost of 5.6 pence, 0.5 pence, where indeed the price they're exposed to may be a special price for gullible people just like them, not the price that's being advertised to the public at large. So we've got to be really careful about turning advertising into an efficiency game, because actually ill-targeted, by which I mean widely disseminated, expensive communication might cost more. In fact, by definition, it almost certainly does, but it might be more effective. So efficiency and effectiveness aren't necessarily the same thing. You might also add that the most valuable thing an advertisement can do is get someone from 0 to 1, as two previous speakers have both said, okay? And therefore, the very idea of targeting may be mistaken. That actually, if you can get someone effectively who's never heard of your product to have heard of it, and someone who's never bought your product to buy it, that is a greater victory in marketing terms than getting someone who already buys it to buy a bit more. Because the long-term significance of that is greater. If you want an example of advertisers who are obsessed with efficiency and therefore do a terrible job of effectiveness, railway companies. Have you noticed this? Because they can get cheap ad space on railway stations, 99% of railway advertising appears on fucking railway stations to people who by definition are already using the fucking train, right? Okay, I mean, unless you're some weird pervert who hangs around railway stations without actually going anywhere. And so they go, why would we pay full price for media and talk to people who don't take the train when we can talk to people who are already taking the train at a slightly lower cost? You know, from a financial efficiency point of view, it's a brilliant decision. From a marketing point of view, it's complete insanity, okay? And the really thing you need to do with rail people is actually, if you can get someone who's taking the train never to take it 3 times, you've essentially, you've broken the duck. Now you've got someone who next time they have to make a journey will at least think, maybe I ought to go by train. Previously, the train doesn't even occur to them. They go by car without even thinking. So this is the question where, if we can just go back to the PowerPoint thing, sorry about this. Efficiency and effectiveness aren't the same thing. It's very, very easy, because in large parts of business they are the same thing. It's very easy to make something more efficient, clap yourself on the back on the assumption you've done a great job, when actually, in effectiveness terms, it's not all that great. And oops, if you can just, I just need to go back to the PowerPoint. Next slide. As I said, with weddings, it's also got to be expensive, okay? I presented in India in December, and I made the point that there was actually no point in Indian GDP growing by 8% a year, because the extra was just going to be spent on weddings anyway. But the simple fact is, an engagement ring has to hurt the man who's buying it. Why? Because it's upfront expense as proof of long-term intention. If you want someone to believe, what's a very good proxy indicator of the fact that someone's going to be an honest player? The idea that they intend to be in the market for a long time, okay? We trust a kebab shop more than we trust a kebab van. The kebab van can poison 3 people in a town and just move on 20 miles and start again. The kebab shop has actually invested in leases, in equipment, and lots of immovable assets. He can't afford to poison his customers because the cost of moving is much higher. An engagement ring is exactly the same thing, okay? It essentially says, if I were planning a one-night stand, do you think I would have bought this thing, okay? One of the reasons, too, why jewelry and flowers are very potent presents from men to women is precisely because men aren't interested in them. So you can buy your wife jewelry or flowers, okay? Men, if there were no women on the planet, there wouldn't be any florists, really, okay? Or rather, they just sell cactuses and Venus flytraps, you know, bloke plants, right? But if you buy your wife jewelry or flowers, it effectively says, I have made a financial sacrifice to make you happy where there is no suspicion of self-interest, okay? Right? Whereas if you buy your wife a quad bike or a drone for Christmas, there might be the suspicion that you weren't really thinking of her. Okay? So the really important point is that, in a sense, efficient advertising, the very fact that this is inefficient is what makes it convincing. Now, what everybody's trying to do is they're trying to make advertising more like a science, and quite rightly so in many ways, because science is very good. Science is extremely good if you are trying to do something where you can define success in completely objective, human-free terms. So if you want to build a bridge, you want some engineers. And why? Because the definition of a good bridge is, will it take this weight at this frequency, traveling at this speed, for this duration of time, under these weather conditions? And the engineer can answer, yes, this will do this, in which case it's a good bridge, okay? Now, bear in mind there's no subjectivity involved in the definition of what's a good bridge there. You can define it in objective engineering terms, and you solve the problem with engineering. As soon as you paint the lines on the bridge, you're in a different field, because now human psychology matters. This is a road crossing from Iceland, which is deliberately painted in a trompe-l'oeil style to get motorists to slow down. When you paint the lines on the road, now you're in psychology territory, and the same rules don't apply. And what tends to happen is that businesses, in their love of becoming rational and having models for things, they start to overuse, and this is a great competitive weakness you can spot. If you can spot this in a competitor, you can win. The way to win in business is to find out something your competitor assumes is true that isn't. Okay? That's the way to innovate. Find out something that everybody assumes is true that isn't true. Because what happens is people over time get overly fond of their models, and they start using them for places where they don't apply. In London, we have the tube map. It's not actually a map. It's called a schematic diagram. And it's a very, very good schematic diagram of how the tube lines fit together. The only problem I've noticed is that over time, people have stopped using it as a map of the tube, and they've started using it as a map of London. And so North Londoners, nearly all the tube is in North London, because in South London you have railways, but those commuter railways don't appear on the map. So North Londoners haven't got a clue how South Londoners get to work. I mean, they genuinely don't have a clue. And you also have this deluded thing where people who live in a place called Fulham, which is along there on the green bit, because they're on the tube, they think they live in central London. It's practically a suburb of fucking Oxford, as far as I'm concerned. Okay? Some friends of mine moved from Fulham, which was on the tube, to a place called Herne Hill, which isn't on the tube. And because it had hill in the name and it wasn't on the tube, they thought they were moving into the outer darkness. And on their first day at work, they discovered to their amazement that their journey to work took them half as long as it had done from Fulham. So what had started to happen is people had taken one map and they'd started using it for parts of London where it didn't fit. Or actually, tourists always go wrong with this. The most common tourist journey undertaken on the tube is Leicester Square to Covent Garden, which is a distance so short you could throw a tennis ball between the two stations. But the people looking at the map don't realize that the map has absolutely no geographical fidelity at all. It's just there to show how the lines interlock. So the bit in the middle, which is complicated, has to be insanely expanded to make the thing possible to read. And all businesses do this. They start assuming things and they start overusing them. And that's the opportunity for innovation or experimentation. Take something that everybody assumes is true and pretend the opposite. Now, what bees do is fascinating here. Now, this is what I said. One thing that creative people do, which annoys me, is they go into businesses and they go, it's all about creativity, it's all about imagination. As I said, it's not. Okay? A large part of business is about being totally logical, consistent, pursuing efficiency, exploiting what you already know, following best practice, all that stuff. but a percentage of business shouldn't be. And that's the 10 to 20% where you actually say, okay, we've spent 80% of our effort exploiting what we already know. Now what we've got to do is find out what we're wrong about. And bees do this, so 80% of bees basically follow the waggle dance. Bees do a little dance to say there's nectar over there, 2.5 miles in that direction, and the bees dutifully follow off, and they collect the nectar, and they bring it back, and they make it into honey. But much to the bafflement of bee scientists, 20% of bees seem to ignore the waggle dance completely, and they just bugger off at random. And the bee scientists were completely confused by this, because they said, look, you've had 20 million years of bee evolution. Honeybees are much older than humans, okay? You'd think in that time we would have evolved bee compliance officers who would have said, we need to bring our nectar collection targets in line for Q3, so we need a higher level of compliance with the waggle dance. But they don't. 20% of bees go off at random. And then they modeled it as a complex system and realized without the random bees, the hive would get trapped in a local maximum and starve to death. Because it would become over-dependent on what it already knows and stop investing in what it doesn't know. Now, if you're in a changing environment where one or two things can come along and change things completely, if you become overly dependent on collecting pollen and nectar from the field 2 miles away to the southwest, that's great, and you look really efficient, and your short-term ROI looks brilliant, and then some cows break into the field and eat all the flowers, and you don't know where to go next. So what these other bees are doing is they're essentially hedging bets. They're effectively saying, okay, for every amount of energy we spend exploiting the knowledge we already have, we need to spend a certain amount of knowledge, a certain amount of effort finding out what we're wrong about. Now, the significant thing here, if you think about it, is those two sets of bees, if it is bees, it may be different journeys, they've got to have a completely different ROI, haven't they? They've got to have a completely different metric. Because the main bees, the 80% of bees, it's nectar and pollen collected in energy value must exceed the energy expended in collecting it. Fairly simple short-term efficiency metric. For the other bees, it's, look, we accept the fact that 99, it's like discovering Viagra or something. We accept the fact that 99% of your journeys are a bit of a waste of time, but one time in 100, you'll discover a completely new source of nectar, which will keep us thriving for another 3 months, where the ROI is probably, 20,000 to 1. And very similar, actually, to Nassim Taleb's barbell investment strategy. Put 80% in less risk, low reward, very low risk. That's to ensure you don't go bankrupt, okay? That's, and then ignore the middle. Don't bother with the middle. And then put a small percentage in things where you have a finite, knowable, containable downside, as with a random bee journey. You know what it costs, but where the potential upside can be huge. So you're exploiting asymmetry, in other words. And I think that's what we need to do in advertising, because all the time what I keep noticing is if you go around without, to be honest, I hate saying this, but without much of a plan, you start noticing things where companies are throwing away 8 million quid through one very simple mistake. We've spotted it twice with British Airways, just to be clear. Once, it used to be the case with BA that you go to the main website and it'd say, where do you want to go? When do you want to go? Date. That's right. And then it said, so date, time of day, class of travel. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable question for a business traveller, because they know those three things, because their boss has presumably told them to go somewhere specific on a specific time, and their company travel policy tells them which class they're allowed to go in. For a consumer, if you think about it, it's totally insane, because how can I answer that what class of travel do I want question? Never mind the fact that I may not even know when I want to go, okay? But how can I answer what class of travel do I want until I know the price difference? If it's £30 more to go business class, I'll probably go business class. If it's 300, I might not. And so we said, you're throwing away everybody that is defaulting to searching only for economy tickets. And therefore, in those cases where a business class ticket might be a really good deal or a premium economy ticket might be a really good deal, they're not even seeing them. So we changed the design of that. That was, multiple millions of pounds of incremental premium revenue. I noticed it flying out to Sweden today. The BA website does something crazy, and I've got to fly back and tell them that if a flight is fully booked, it doesn't appear on the internet search. It just doesn't appear. Now, first of all, having fully booked is a really great way of creating scarcity value. Because let me tell you, if the 9:20 is already fully, or the 8:20 is fully booked, I'm sure as hell going to book a ticket on the 10:20 right away. But because the ticket doesn't appear, unless you are nerdily obsessed with the BA timetable, you'll just assume that BA doesn't have a flight from Heathrow to Stockholm until 10:30 in the morning. So you won't think, gosh, I must book a ticket because the early flight's booked up. You think, these people are fucking idiots. The first flight to Stockholm is at 10:30 in the morning. I won't search for BA again because clearly they think that nobody wants to get to Stockholm before 2 in the afternoon. Okay? So there are mistakes like that which are £1 million mistakes, and what's the interesting thing is they're butterfly effects, essentially. In complexity theory, they're those things where very, very small changes can make very, very big difference. And that's what the bees are looking for. They're looking for butterflies. And so 10 to 20% of your time as marketers, maybe 10 to 20% of your time as budgets. Now, what Nassim makes clear about that investment strategy is you've got to look at them differently. The way you react if you lose money on the right should be with complete equanimity. If you lose money on the left, you should panic, because that investment isn't supposed to be losing you money. If on the right you're investing in theatrical productions, for example, and 3 of them have failed, you go, I don't care. I expected 3 of them to fail because 1 in 6 will make me £1 million. You know, I'll invest in Hamilton or something and make it all back with that. And so having the same metrics and the same incentives and the same bonuses across the board in a business is fatal. We've got to partition things off, and I think Mark was saying exactly the same thing. We've got to partition things off and measure different activities in a different way. Because one of the problems about actually having efficiency metrics across the board is it turns people into cowards. Because if what you are hoping to do is improve something by 4.5% annually, you're not going to try anything brave, because if it's very successful, it gives you a problem, and if it fails, it gives you a problem. So we've got to have separate metrics and separate incentives for different forms of marketing activity. Does that make sense? Now, the other point we've got to do is, with the tube map, if you want to buy a house, everybody's looking at the tube map. The best thing you can do if you want to buy a house in London is go, where would someone who knows only the tube map never buy a house? And you'd buy a house on the South London rail network. Because people who use the tube map come with a load of weird assumptions. Of course, what they don't understand is there are fast trains. The tube stops at every single station. So they assume the further out you are, the longer your journey to work takes. But actually, if you move to Bromley South, or you move to Sevenoaks, or you move to Orpington, there are trains that don't stop between Orpington and central London. So distance as a proxy for journey time breaks down when you move from the tube to the rail network. So at some point, look at testing the opposite of what everybody else assumes. Take something that's a logical person would do and say, we're going to try the opposite. Let's suppose you want to compete with Coca-Cola, okay? For about 150 years, you know, it's become the most successful cold non-alcoholic drink in the world apart from water. And if you were sitting in a meeting and said, we want to compete with Coke, you'd say, right, we need a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can, so people get great value for money. Now, because you're using standard economic logic, the burden of proof you'll be required to fulfill there is incredibly low. Anything you suggest that's logical will be passed in 5 minutes. The second you suggest anything counterintuitive, the burden of proof becomes immense. It's one of the reasons why marketing is so difficult, because all good marketing contains something a bit counter-logical. Now, okay, so we want to compete with Coke. We produce a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can, okay? No one's going to disagree with that on logical premise, right? The only problem is the most successful attempt to compete with Coke in the last 50 years is this. Comes in a tiny can, costs a fortune, and it tastes disgusting. Okay? Now, what's going on there is really interesting, because I've had debates with food companies about we need to produce ice cream that doesn't taste very nice. And people go, you're crazy. You're the biggest ice cream market in Europe, aren't you, you people, weirdly? Okay, yeah. Pretty big on licorice, as far as I can see as well. Yeah, now, what's probably going on there is it's actually when a drink is assumed to have medicinal or psychoactive powers, the rules are completely different. okay? If it's a soft drink, Fanta's great, tastes nice, comes in a big can, okay? The second you're making a claim that it has psychotropic or medicinal powers, it's got to taste weird. The fact that it's expensive says it's really potent. The fact that it comes in a tiny can says, shit, this must be powerful, because they had to make the can specially small to stop people basically overdosing and going insane, okay? And the fact that it costs a fortune and the fact that it tastes weird, they're all good attributes in a medicine. They're bad attributes in a child's soft drink, okay? Even better, of course, when it was launched, there were rumors it was going to be banned. There is nothing better you can do in marketing terms than start rumors that something's going to be banned. So the first rule, one really important thing, this is where building a bridge and marketing are fundamentally different. In engineering, in physics, the opposite of a good idea is usually wrong. In psychology, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. And I'll explain why in a second, okay? But always test counterintuitive things, because that's what your competitors will never do. And similarly, as I said, don't assume that in order to improve the consumer perception of something, the first thing you have to do is to change the thing in reality. You don't. As I said, if you want to improve the Eurostar, don't necessarily try and make it faster, because you'll never be as fast as an aircraft anyway, right? The reason people take the train from London to Paris isn't because it's faster than flying. It isn't. It would actually be faster to go by plane. The difference is, on a train, you get to plonk your ass in a seat for 3 hours and can get on with some work. If you fly, people dick you around every 30 minutes and make you go to the security line, to the lounge, to the gate, to the plane, to the arrivals hall, to the passport control, and you can't get any work done. It's totally low-quality time when you fly. It's high-quality time when you take the train. So I said, why not exploit that? Put Wi-Fi on the train. That's hard to do on a plane. It was 10 years ago. Put the world's top male and female supermodels, walking them up and down the train, handing out free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers, okay? That'll be £5 billion cheaper than building faster tracks, and people will ask for the trains to be slowed down. Don't assume that objective reality matters all that much in human behavior. What determines what people do, okay, is simply you have an objective thing, then you have the context in which it's perceived, okay? Then you have the perception of that thing in that context, the emotion generated by that perception, or the meaning generated by that perception, the emotion generated by that meaning, and then the emotion drives the behavior. And that is not a neat mapping. In physics, one thing maps neatly and predictably onto another. In human behavior, because you're going through 4 or 5 intermediate stages, the mapping's anything but neat. I'll skip that one for reasons. As a result, as I mentioned with denim, as I mentioned with Red Bull, you can only find truth with logic if you've already found truth without it. That a lot of our great discoveries we discover by accident, by intuition, by hunch, by instinct, and then we try them, and when they succeed, we post-rationalize them. But the logic has not played a decisive part in actually coming to the discovery in the first place. And that's one of the most important things we have to test when we test advertising, is occasionally test the opposite of what we think makes sense. And so the two great broken binoculars which tend to be used in business decision-making are standard economic theory and economic logic. And literal market research. And they're both really, really dangerous. Because economics is a terrible guide to how people behave. In many cases, you can increase sales of things by putting the price up. Economists get really angry when you tell them this. Let me give you a very simple example. Imagine you go into a shop, and there are 2 products, and one of them appears to be better than the other. It has more features and more functionality. And the better one is a lower price than the one that doesn't seem to be as good. Now, to an economist, that's the easiest decision in the world, isn't it? Higher utility, lower price. But humans have a social intelligence, not just an economic intelligence. And they go, that's a bit weird. If I was selling a better product, I'd charge more for it. Fair enough. So why the hell is this apparently better product cheaper? Something doesn't make sense here. And if I can't make sense of it, I'm not going to buy either of them. Because I can't make sense of the trade-off anymore. Nespresso did that. Did anybody notice with the new Virtuo machine? It had 2 machines, the Virtuo and the Virtuo Plus. and it was selling them at the same price. And I emailed them and said, you're batshit crazy. No one can buy a machine called the Virtuo Plus unless it costs £5 more than the Virtuo. And I went into the shop and the salesman was saying, everybody keeps asking me that and I can't answer the question, so they don't buy one. That's my point about how economics, if you've got an inferior competitor, you've got to charge more than them, because otherwise people can't make sense of it. I had a friend who was doing a behavioural science degree who worked in the email marketing for a London theatre chain. And she did an experiment which very rapidly meant she found that discounting theatre tickets reduced demand. Now, when you think about that, you think, that's a bit weird. How can that be? You know, if you're an economist, you're actually getting really angry now. Perfectly obvious, because a night at the theatre is bloody expensive, even without buying the tickets, okay? You've got to have babysitting, you've got to have a meal out, you've got to pay for car parking, you've got to dick around, okay? So it's going to set you back 200 quid. Now, the last thing you want to do is spend 200 quid on a shit play. Because let's face it, you could have stayed at home and watched Netflix for free. So the fact that the play is discounted was taken by consumers as an indication that it wasn't very good. And so this woman said, look, I've done the tests. If you discount theatre tickets, it reduces demand. And people will come to her from this chain of theatres and they'd say, we've got 100 unsold tickets for the Wednesday matinee for so-and-so, so-and-so. I want you to email our customer database and tell them to have them for 25% off. And she said, I'll happily email the database, but I won't mention the 25% off because it'll reduce demand. And, you know, that means you'll sell fewer tickets and at a lower price, okay? Which, call me old-fashioned, but that's not what capitalism is supposed to be doing, okay? And they go, oh, right. And in every case, they'd come back 10 minutes later and say, can you discount them anyway? And she said, well, I've just explained, you'll sell fewer tickets and at a lower price. And they go, yeah, but my boss won't shout at me. Because if you do something that's consistent with economic theory, you never get into trouble. Because if she doesn't sell all the tickets, the boss will go, but if you discounted them, we would have sold all of them. Now, that isn't true, but it's conventionally true if you believe that economics is a guide to human behavior. And so lots and lots of people, if you think about it, if you do anything, if you go into a board meeting and say, product X isn't selling, so we're going to drop the price, you'll probably get that decision improved in about 4 minutes. If you say product X isn't selling, so we're going to put the price up and do an advertising campaign featuring a dancing duck, which might be a better decision in business terms, the burden of proof that will be required of you will be literally 100 times greater, okay? Because if you do something that basically sits with standard economic theory, it gets passed on the nod. If you do anything consistent with marketing theory, everybody demands huge levels of proof before you're even allowed to proceed. And that's why our lives are so fucking tiring. But notice this, right? Very simple bias in all business decision making. If you have a creative suggestion, I think quite rightly, if you come up with a wacky idea, you have to go and show it to a load of accountants and people, and they'll do a cost-benefit analysis and a feasibility study and all this sort of stuff, okay? Doesn't apply the other way around, does it? If a rational person comes up with an idea, they never say, well, this seems to make sense, but I'm going to show it to some wacky people to see if they've got any other ideas. And as a result, you have this weird thing in business where rational people are totally unpoliced, whereas creative people are effectively more or less kept under house arrest. And it's an extraordinarily dangerous bias. Because, let me explain a very quick story if I've got time. I probably haven't got time, never mind. Okay, so we do a test for a charity. The charity drops off envelopes, volunteers drop off envelopes every year to a few million homes. And we test 50,000 envelopes times 4 with a slightly different creative approach, okay? And the 3 of the 4 things we test are basically behavioral science things. They're counterintuitive. Mentioning that the envelopes were delivered by hand to get the reciprocation instinct kicked off, okay? This is a person actually came round to your door to do this, so the least you can do is give them a couple of quid, okay? Reciprocation. Economists don't understand it. We made higher quality paper for the envelope, costly signalling. We put the flap of the envelope down the narrow edge, not the wide edge, because we said that felt more like a pay packet that you put money into. All 3 of those tests are entirely emotional and irrational. The fourth test was, we'll mention a thing called gift aid, which means that for every pound you give, the government will give another 25p. Totally rational suggestion, okay? Why not mention it? Every £10 you give, another £2.50 is added to your donation for free. The three irrational things improved the volume of donations by 14%. Now, bear in mind, we're talking about millions, tens of millions of pounds here. This is a lot of money, okay? The mention of gift aid, which, to be honest, me too, okay, I would have approved without testing. I would have said, why would you not mention this? Reduced donations by over 30%. By mentioning the one economically rational suggestion we tested was basically killing kids, okay? Right? And so suddenly I realized that testing isn't just testing creative things to see if they might work. It's actually, we need to test rational things to see if they're false assumptions. Because lots of things that make sense, just as there are lots of things that work but don't make sense. Denim, I've mentioned, right? Can anybody make fun? I don't own any denim. I just don't understand, right? Nobody's ever been able to explain to me why it's a good thing to wear, why it's in any way a desirable fabric. But there are also things that make sense and don't work, and we never test those. You know, when KFC had a product that wasn't selling, they dropped the price. I said, no, try putting the price up. They said, it'd be ridiculous. They sold more at a higher price than they did at the previous price or at the lower price. Now, there's a reason why, I think. Okay, let's face it, we go to KFC for two things, a bargain or a treat. And I always say mid-market retail, you don't get an endorphin rush from mid-market retail, do you? You get a bit of a rush going to Aldi, you get a bit of a thrill going to TK Maxx and getting a bargain, and you get a bit of a thrill buying something from, you know, Mulberry or from a luxury goods brand, right? Both of them are kind of high thrill experiences. The middle is nowhere. It's not a bargain and it's not a treat. I learned this going shopping for bedding with my wife, because I'd been looking at various bits of bedding, and after a while I said to her, there are two amounts of money I'm happy to spend in here. I said, nothing and a lot. And I said, what the hell do you mean? I said, well, if we spend nothing, we can make do with the bedding we got already. I won't notice the difference, and I can go and buy a drone or something, okay? And I said, if we spend a lot, I can get nerdily excited by thread counts and tog values and mattress toppers. And those, does anybody like those Oxford pillowcases, which actually have a kind of hem thing around the outside, which are weirdly much nicer than other pillows? Is that true? Do anyone agree? That for some reason a pillow is made much nicer if there's like a bit of cloth all around the outside. I don't know why either, but they are nicer, aren't they? Okay? And they're better for pillow fights, obviously, because you can get a bit of purchase. But I think there are a lot of things like that. Genuinely, where I'm happy spending a lot of money, I'm happy spending no money. I don't want to spend money in the middle, because we just get the same shit bedding we've got already, and I've spent 200 quid. And I think understanding that effectively human behavior is totally non-linear, and that the bad news about things that are non-linear is that they're harder to predict and you've got to do a lot of experimentation. The good news is you can discover butterfly effects where really small things have huge effects. I'll skip this just for reasons of time. And the other thing you've got to realize is that we don't really know why we do the things we do. I haven't got time to explain the evolutionary reasons, but in order to deceive other people, we first have to deceive ourselves. So it's not in our evolutionary interests to have perfect introspection into our behavior. Because if in evolutionary terms, there are a lot of things we're doing, it's better we don't know, right? Also, what's really important in evolutionary terms is this. This is very similar to some arithmetic that Mark showed you earlier. We are limited in how we can explain our behavior because the parts of the brain that do the talking aren't representative of the parts of the brain that do the deciding. And so we don't really have the vocabulary for describing how we make decisions. And so when we make a decision, what we think we're trying to do is to maximize the optimality, the average outcome of the decision. Okay? I'm trying to buy the best television I can for $2,000. That's what we think we're trying to do. And that's what we'd say to a market researcher. Because the part of our brain that goes blah, 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 and post-rationalizes isn't really connected. It doesn't have introspective access to the part of the brain which goes, I'll have that telly over there. Okay? Genuinely, there's a kind of disconnect. And a lot of what we're trying to do, now, 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 is the same as 1 plus 3 plus 1 plus 3 plus 1 plus 3. If you multiply, it's different. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, much bigger number than 1 times 3 times 1 times 3 times 1 times 3. In order to maximize the time average growth rate, what humans have evolved to do is to minimize variance. So a long row of 2s is better than 1s and 3s. And so a lot of what we're trying to do when we buy a TV is not just to buy the best TV we can, but to minimize the downside variance. What that means is minimize the risk of buying a really terrible TV. Minimize the risk of getting a 0 or a 0.5. That's why McDonald's is the most popular restaurant in the world, okay? It's not because it's really, really good, it's because it's really good at not being terrible. Fair? Okay, so we've all been there, we're in a foreign country, we haven't got all day, we need to eat fairly quickly, and what we know is if we go in there, we'll like the food, we won't get ripped off, it'll be reasonably enjoyable, our kids will all eat it, our family will all eat it, it'll be pretty tasty, and we won't get the shits, okay? Now, none of those things actually is true of a Michelin-starred restaurant. Specifically not the last one. The chance of getting the shits is much higher in a Michelin's. Agreed? Okay, you go out for a fancy meal, odds of spending the afternoon on the bog, much higher than if you go to the Golden Arches. In fact, a 3-star Michelin restaurant in the UK had the worst ever novovirus outbreak, I think, of any restaurant in Britain. Also with very fancy restaurants. Now, I'm not suggesting you take your people to McDonald's for a date, okay? For signaling purposes, it's not very good, okay? That's what Nando's is for. Okay? But if you want low variance, McDonald's is fantastic. Right, that's super. Now, the mistake we're making is we're thinking of the decisions we take like archery, where you aim for the 10. There's only one strategy in archery, aim for the bullseye. Okay? There's no trade-off. You know, there's no, should I aim for the bullseye? That's why archery isn't a very popular televised sport. Because it's fucking boring, right? Imagine the worst job in the world would be being an archery commentator. You know, what do you think he's going to do now, Dave? I think he's going to aim for the bullseye just as he has on all 4,000 previous fucking occasions. By contrast, real life decisions are like darts. Now, bear in mind I had to present this in Paris last week, and they're good at culture, the French, but as a darting nation, they're nowhere, I have to say. Their record in darts is atrocious. Have you noticed that? Quite good if you want a bit of poetry, a bit of philosophy. And if you want to sit outside a cafe in a stripy jumper, you want a Frenchman. Darts, no, not a chance, right? Now, the interesting thing with darts is the very best bit on the board, the triple 20, is surrounded by scores like 1 and 5. So if you want to aim for the top, you risk very high downside variance if you miss. And so, in a sense, instinctively, our vocabulary is designed to explain a behavior which is maximizing. I'm going for the triple 20. Our instincts, deeper in our brain, are going, you definitely don't want to get a 1 or a 5. In fact, if you're not very good at darts, aim for the southwestern quadrant of the board, where on average you'll get a higher score than if you aim for the triple 20. Do you know that? That's the satisficer's way to play darts. All of us, the reason this is important is that explains why we pay a premium for brands. I don't think we see brands as being proof that the product's better. I think we see brands as a reliable mark of low downside risk. Someone with a lot of reputational skin in the game has much more to lose from selling a terrible product than someone who we've never heard of before. That's why familiarity is so important as a heuristic for why we... Now, anybody here shop on eBay? Okay? The second someone drops below about 98%, you won't buy anything from them, will you, basically? You go, I don't trust this guy anymore. He hasn't got enough reputational skin in the game. Someone who sold 10,000 things and has a 100% rating, it's taken him 5 years to earn that reputation. He isn't going to throw that away for the sake of selling you a piece of shit that's fake for 5 kroner, okay? So you can trust that guy. In the same way, someone who's famous is inherently has more to gain from deploying quality control than someone who isn't. And so we see brands. This is why consumers pay a premium for brands without understanding why they do. Because it's the amygdala going, oh, I don't trust that telly, I've never heard of it. Okay? The rational brain's going, I'm trying to buy the best television I can. But when it comes to taking the thing to the till, you go, screw this, I'm paying $200 more for the Samsung. We've all done it, right? Because we just don't quite trust the other one. And all of us, most living creatures, are wired like a smoke detector to ask that question, yeah, but what, yeah, that's all fine in theory, but what's the worst that can happen? You could do this with your cat. Put a cucumber behind it, right? Watch, and... Okay? Yeah. Now, the cat, at some level, probably knows, even when it's jumping, that it isn't a snake. But why take the risk? It might be a snake. Okay? Similarly, your smoke detector probably goes, look, the fucker's probably just making toast, but why take the risk? We're all wired very strongly because all of us are descended from people who managed to avoid catastrophe long enough to have sex at least once. Okay? And the cats that didn't jump when there was a cucumber aren't around anymore because they all got eaten by snakes. Okay? Now, the reason that's so important is it explains a huge amount of human behavior and why we have to be counter-rational or irrational as marketers. Because people don't make decisions the way even they think they make decisions, let alone how other people think they make them. And that business of the fear thing, that explains why nobody ever moves their current account in a bank. Because although you'll get an extra 1.5% APR on your current account, the fact is, moving your current account comes with a 5% chance of your life becoming total shit. So nobody takes it. And similarly, you can't sell cocktails to men unless the bar menu, we discovered this, unless the bar menu has a picture or a drawing of the glass in which the cocktail is served. Because if the male brain thinks there's a 1% chance this thing will turn up, he'll order a beer instead. The way to sell cocktails to guys is just say, all our cocktails come in mason jars. And they'll drink them all evening happily. So, very quickly, perception, and the final point I'm going to make, I've only got a few minutes left. So, A, we don't make decisions the way we think we make decisions. Red Bull kind of tastes disgusting. If you ask people, what do you think of this drink? They did, they researched it. People said, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to. But if you frame it in the context of something medicinal or psychoactive, it's great. By the way, wine tastes better if you tell people it's expensive. Wine tastes better if you pour it from a heavier bottle. Chocolate tastes sweeter if you make the cubes rounder. Your car drives better after you've had it cleaned. Have you noticed that? It's quieter, accelerates better, its performance is better. Everything about your car becomes better when you've had it cleaned. Our perception is totally wonky. That depending on the context, this is Ludwig von Mises, an Austrian school economist. Whether a meal's good or not doesn't just depend on the meal, what the food is. It depends on what the restaurant's like. If there's a smell of sewage and you're serving Michelin-starred food, no one will enjoy their meal. Okay? If one of the forks on the tines on your fork is slightly out of alignment and you're served magnificent food, you'll have a shit meal. So the idea that there's intrinsic objective good in the object and the service or the marketing just adds a bit of added magic dust isn't true. Very quickly, okay, perception is totally relative. So A, it's leaky. The weight of a bottle of wine will affect how the wine tastes. Knowing a painkiller is expensive will make it more effective. Branded painkillers are more effective. If you hold up your hand to cover the join, what you'll actually see, instead of a white thing joined to a grey thing, as you see on the right, I've done it for you, is you'll see that the top and bottom of that thing are actually the same shade of grey. That's because your brain isn't giving you an objective, accurate depiction of the world. That's why engineering thinking doesn't work when it comes to human behavior. Because engineering is all based on the assumption that objective things lead to predictable outcomes. The mapping in human terms between the objective reality and the behavior is much, much messier than it is with physical objects interacting. If you look at this one, try this.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba. Ba.
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
Ba.
Take another look.
Ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba.
Now to the left of the screen.
Ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion.
So what's incredible about that, this is where engineering thinking can get it wrong. Because the assumption is, in order to improve the experience, you've got to improve the reality. You don't. If you change the context within which the reality is perceived, or if you change human perception so it thinks of something as an energy drink rather than as a soft drink, okay, you can change the emotional reaction and therefore the behavior without changing the objective thing at all. Your television only produces 3 colors. It's a complete lie. It's a total biological hack. If you had to produce a television that produced the whole light spectrum, it would cost billions of pounds and look terrible. Do you know your TV is optimized for you and gorillas and higher primates only? Because we have the 3 color sensors sensitive to those 3 parts of the color spectrum. We have 3 types of cone. Your dog thinks your TV is shit. Okay? If you've got a pet pigeon, it thinks your TV is really shit, because a pigeon can detect 5 different parts of the spectrum, including ultraviolet. So it can't understand why you're sitting there looking at these stupid shapes all day, basically. Okay? It looks nothing like reality. And it's a really big problem with market research, because if you present objective reality and look at behavior, depending on the context, people will actually say completely different things. And it's really, really difficult to assume that people's behavior is a product of objective reality, because it's not. It's a product of meaning, and meaning is highly context sensitive. Generally, if you give money to someone to do something, it's called an incentive or a wage, and it encourages their propensity to do it. But don't pay your wife for sex, because in that context, it doesn't work. I mean, I tried it once as an experiment, and about 4 months later, I got offered some sex. So if it does work, it works very, very slowly, okay? Don't go to a meal with some friends and leave money on the table. You can take them a bottle of wine, but in that context, money is a really bad thing. And meaning is hugely context dependent. Price is context dependent. Nespresso, if you had to buy in a jar like Nescafe, would cost about $50 for a jar. And you'd look at it next to the Nescafe and go, that's batshit crazy. That's for an equivalent amount of caffeine, okay? But the thing is, it doesn't come in a jar, it comes in a pod. So when we actually put that pod of Nespresso in, our frame of reference isn't Nescafe, it's Starbucks. We think, well, it's costing us 29p, but that would cost me £2.20 at Starbucks. This machine's saving me a fortune. Similarly, Rolls-Royce and Maserati stopped exhibiting their cars at car shows so much and started exhibiting them at yacht and aircraft shows. Because a €300,000 car looks really expensive at a car show. If you've been looking at Learjets all afternoon, it's an impulse buy. Okay? And so the same thing can be good or bad depending on how you present it. You can take something that people think is shit, change their attention. Now, if you make the whole debate about whether the Eurostar's faster than flying, you lose, because it isn't. So what you focus on, advertising means to direct attention to, and I think Mark was very much on this, as was Rima actually. What you do is you get people to pay disproportionate attention to the areas where you have a comparative advantage. As a result, that dimension will become more important because they're paying attention to it, and your strength gets amplified and your competitor's strength gets diminished. okay? If you emphasize how nice it is to sit on a train, okay, people stop wanting to go on the aircraft. Very simple. This, okay, the bus to the airport terminal, we all hate it, right? Every time you arrive at an airport and the engines wind down and you see oh shit, it's going to be a bus, you know. And then one day this pilot, we landed at Gatwick and the pilot from EasyJet said, I've got some bad news and some good news. I won't be able to get you an air bridge today because there's a plane blocking the gate. But the good news is the bus will take you all the way to passport control so you won't have far to walk with your bags. And I looked at my companion and said, hey, that's weird. That's always true, isn't it? Why didn't they tell us that before? Because I previously saw the bus as basically an insult. It was a poor man's air bridge. Now I saw it as a conveyance, which meant I didn't have to walk past 25 Toblerone stands in order to get my luggage, okay? If you look at the same thing in two different ways, so marketing should stop referring to added value. It isn't added, it's multiplied value. If you take something that people hate and you market it cleverly, you can make it good. You can take something good and make people not like it. As in this example.
Hello. Hi. Whee! Peep shows. They have a pretty bad name, normally associated with lewd content, but by definition, they don't have to be.
So in an attempt to change that, we took one of the world's biggest performing artists, kept all his clothes on, and set up an Ed Sheeran peep show. Would anyone dare to believe what was written outside and come into our very dodgy looking venue?
How are you feeling?
I don't really know what's going on, to be
That was fair enough, because we dressed Hamish as a fairly shady-looking spruiker in charge of getting customers.
I got you Sheeran. Who wants some Sheeran?
All right, I can hear Hamish.
Do you think we'll get anyone?
I don't think we'll get anyone. It's going to be a brave soul.
I wouldn't come into... If there was a dude with a beard with a hat and saying, like, come in and see this.
Ed was right. This was going to be tough.
You want to peep at Ed Sheeran for $2? Insurance. Do you want to peep at Ed Sheeran? You're lost. What do you reckon, big fella? Got Ed Sheeran in here. Beautiful ginger head man, sitting on a stool. What do you reckon? $2. Got Ed Sheeran just sitting on a stool in there. You want him? $2. $2 for a peep. Think about it. It's actually pretty good value.
Despite trying, we'd had a total lack of interest for over 50 minutes. It's been some time. We should have got you a more comfy chair, I think.
Yeah, I'm all right.
Hey, big fella, got all the Sheeran you need in there, $2.
What is it?
All the Ed Sheeran you need.
All the what?
Ed Sheeran.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
He's a singer. Yeah? Is that a yes? No? I think one of the big problems is people think Ed Sheeran's a code word for a new drug. How's it going? You guys like Ed Sheeran? $2. $2 for a 30-second peep. No, mate.
What, like, are they just saying no?
Yeah.
Category.
Dirt sheet peep. Dirt sheet peep. Here we go, $2.
Do you reckon we're pricing it too high, and that's why we're not getting people coming in?
I think $2 is pretty fair.
Here we go, boys. It's a Friday. Get you Ed Sheeran peep show. $2. Sitting on a stool, play you a song.
If someone actually does think it's a peep show, and I quickly give you the go-ahead to take off all your clothes, you're willing to do that?
I've been drinking a lot of beer recently.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You're not?
A couple of months ago, maybe, but
Yep.
yeah, I'm in shape. It's just the shape of a potato.
2 hours in, and Hamish was getting more desperate.
Ed Sheeran is literally sitting in there on the stage waiting for your $2.
We were feeling it as well, but just when we thought this had been a giant waste of everyone's time.
You guys like Ed Sheeran?
I love it.
You love Ed Sheeran? $2, peep show. Just got him sitting on stage in there.
Ah, you're lying.
Oh, $2.
Are you
It's
for real?
gonna cost you $2. You only get 30 seconds though. You wanna come in?
I
Mate.
don't believe you.
Well, there's only one way to find out.
We might be on here.
Here we go. Ed Sheeran peep show. He's there till midday. All right, your choice.
No, she did the smart thing and walked away.
Listen, if you guys want, I'm just saying, if you guys want to have a go, he's sitting in there by himself. It'll probably get busy later on. $2, 30 seconds. I mean, you both can come if you want. Just $2 a head. Everything's above board, I can assure you.
I'm gonna get
Nah, absolutely not. Like, I can't guarantee what Ed'll do, but yeah, let's pay you $2.
And after 2 hours and 23 minutes, including some final hesitation, we finally found people brave enough to take a peek.
Did you guys go to peep shows a lot, or?
No, it'll be some kind of...
There you go, mate. Keep your clothes on, stay on the seat, behave yourselves. Just listen to the announcement. Have a good one. Enjoy your peep.
Hello and welcome to the Peep Show. Your time will start
In 5 seconds.
I'm actually a bit scared. Oh, it's
Darling, I will be loving you till we're 70. Baby, my heart can still fall as hard at 23. And I'm thinking about how people fall in love.
What time is it? Thank you very much, Steve.
All right, guys, there you go. Have fun. Now, it's very simple thought experiment. If you'd placed a single ad in the Melbourne The Age, isn't it, or the Sydney Morning Herald, you would have had a queue down 10 city blocks, wouldn't you? Okay? So marketing isn't added value, multiplies value. You have a great thing, you present it in the wrong way, you destroy value. If you have a great thing presented in the right way, you create multiples of the same value. Because as I said, you don't have the thing, Ed Sheeran, and the behavior, the willingness to pay to go and see him. You have the thing, you know, the believability of the thing, the meaning of the thing, our perception of the thing, the emotion generated by that perception, and then our behavior. And so there's more going on psychologically than there is objectively in any bit of behavior. And the marketing function, therefore, is vital. We drink wine in restaurants, not really because we want to, but because restaurants make it really difficult for us not to. But we don't notice. They have wine glasses on the table already when we go in. They don't call it a drinks list, do they? They call it the wine list. And the choice architecture of the wine list is like 4 pages of stupid varieties of wine, and then there's this sad back page for the perverts and weirdos who want to drink beer or spirits. Okay? Now, the reason they do that is because you can make much more markup on wine than you can on anything else, because nobody knows what it cost originally. Okay? You know, you can't charge 30 quid for a glass of Johnny Walker Red, because people knows what it costs in the shops. But you can go and buy a bottle of Chateau de Bollocks, you know, 2015, for €6 and charge 30 for it. Everyone will go, marvellous, hint of black currants, right? And then even cleverer still, they only bring out one wine list. So the guy at the end of the table has one wine list. There's only one alcoholic drink you can all share. So other than saying tequila slammers all round, which isn't very sophisticated, the only thing that guy with the single wine list can do once you give it to him is turn to the rest of the table and go, red or white. So the restaurant, without you even knowing it, has forced you to drink wine using entirely psychological techniques. In the same way, we worked with a pizza company. They said, the one thing we know in pizza, you remember what I said? Take one thing that everybody assumes is true and pretend it isn't, okay? Everybody in the pizza delivery business assumes that everybody wants it as fast as possible. We said, well, that's just like everybody drinking wine in a restaurant. It doesn't mean they want that. It's that everybody assumes they want it, so they behave according to the assumption. If you go onto the app, the default is ASAP. If you go to the website, the default is ASAP. If you ring up, they never say, when would you like your pizza? Unless you specify with an incredible degree of repetition, I don't want it until 9:15, they'll deliver it as soon as possible. So we said, why don't you try and see what people really want? Because if you make the default 45 minutes, or you make it a time of day rather than a duration, people's behavior will be totally different. Why does that matter? Because if you can get some people to wait longer, you can put 3 deliveries on one bike. Instead of the bike going pizza delivered back to base, pizza delivered back to base, it can go base, deliver pizza, deliver pizza, deliver pizza, back to base, right? You've got what's called a buffer. We tested it. You could push the default out as far as an hour, and it had no downward effect on sales. Weirder still, customer satisfaction went up by 50%. Why? We don't know, really. To be honest, okay? This is what I mean. You have to test things that don't make sense as a simple acknowledgement that we know much less than we think we know, and that we're too eager to pretend that the world makes sense. So I'll end on this very quickly. Uber psychologically changes the nature of waiting. Because when you can see the cab approaching, and when Uber also manages your expectations by telling you, waiting time about 8 minutes, the usual annoyance of booking a minicab has been completely diminished. What was annoying wasn't the duration, objective measure, it was the uncertainty. Is that my cab over there? Oh, he said 10 minutes, he isn't here yet, where is he? Maybe he's already left, okay? Whereas with Uber, you go, oh, look, he's stuck at those traffic lights, I'll have another pint. Even better with Uber, you can do that thing. Does anybody else do this? Will anybody else admit it? Where you go out onto the pavement exactly at the time the car draws up? Because it makes you feel like Kaiser Soze at the end of The Usual Suspects, right? Okay? You can change, if you want diversity, change the context in which people choose, you change the decisions they make. That's it in one sentence, right? If you want diversity of employment in your company, if you hire people in groups, people will automatically hire a wide range of people. If you hire people one at a time, they go conformity, close to the norm. Okay? It's the only reason I got my job. They had 4 jobs. If 4 people had been hiring for one job, I wouldn't have got any of them. They had 4 jobs, and they thought, okay, we've got 2 people who we know can do this. We've got somebody who we know can do this. Let's take a punt on the weirdo, basically, is what they said. I discovered this years later. I've been at Ogilvy for 30 years. Okay? If you want diversity, socio-economic diversity, talent diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, if you hire people in a group, you'll get much more diversity if you hire people one at a time, because our approach to downside risk is different. If you think about it, when everybody had one car, they all had a saloon car. Once you have a household with 2 cars, they don't have 2 saloon cars. In fact, they probably don't even have 1 saloon car. They have like an SUV and a small town car. Variance goes up with the number of choices we're making. Allow people to make only one choice, and they'll make a really boring choice. So that's me in one sentence. Change the context within which people choose. You change the entire meaning and motivation of what they're doing, and that means you change what they do. Which means that actually the attention we pay to worrying about objective reality is probably disproportionate to the time we need to spend not only thinking about, but really, really experimenting with context, meaning, and perception. Because that's where the really big gains are to be had. And I'll tell you why, very, very simply. And it's kind of good news. We're much more wrong about psychology than we are about physics. Producing a faster aircraft is going to be really fucking hard. Producing an aircraft which people enjoy being on, that's an easier problem to solve. That's all you need to know. Thank you very much indeed. Oh.